Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Today we are interviewing Rabbi Pauline Bebe, who has been ordained rabbi in 1990 at the age of 25. She's the very first woman rabbi in France, and she has created the Communauté Juive Libérale in the 11th arrondissement in Paris. She was a French woman of a family of émigrés, and she has attended a liberal synagogue when she was young, the Copernic synagogue, and there were no rabbinical schools for women in France. After your regular studies of the university in Paris, you had to go to England to study in order to become a rabbi, right?
That's right.
There were no women rabbis in France. Instead, in England, in the United States, in Germany, in Holland, there are women.
Well, when I became a rabbi, I became also the first on the continent after Regina Jonas, who was the first woman rabbi in the world, who was ordained in 1938. And she was ordained by a Talmud professor. There was at the time a seminary in Berlin, the Hochschule for the Wissenschaft des Judentums. And so unfortunately, she was deported in Theresienstadt and in Auschwitz. She worked a little bit with Rabbi Dr. Leobeck. And so after her, I became the first on continental Europe to
be a rabbi.
Yeah.
Is it written in the Jewish law normally that women cannot be rabbis?
Not really. I mean, because the question was not asked in a world that was not giving women the same place. But there are some women that are some rabbinical roles in the past, women that had also an important role in the Bible, a few women in the Talmud also who knew the law and could discuss with the rabbis, but there were exceptions.
In your biography, it said that from a very young age, you wanted to become a rabbi. Why?
I studied, as you said, at the synagogue in Copernic. I went to what we call Talmud Torah, the Cheder, the Sunday school. And I was fascinated by what I was studying, by text. And also, my parents had both professions that's of service to people. That is to say, my father was a pediatrician and my mother was a lawyer. The service to people, which is the main part of the rabbinical role, I learned from them. And so when I had my bat mitzvah in 1977, then I thought I'm very interested by philosophy and Judaism. So I went on studying, and then it became obvious to me that my vocation was to be a rabbi.
But in order to do that, you had to go to England, right?
That's right.
And how many years you studied in England?
I spent 2 years in London at Leobeck College. Then I studied 2 years.
Leobeck College, right?
Leobeck College.
Right.
I studied then 2 years in Jerusalem, and then another year back in Leobeck before I became a rabbi in 1990. And I was ordained in London, in West London Synagogue by Dr. Albert Friedlander.
But when you studied to be a rabbi, you were a regular rabbi, not particularly liberal at the time, or it was already liberal?
I had learned at Copernic, liberalism was there, but not in the same way as in England. I really encountered progressive Judaism when I was in London, and I saw so many rabbis passing by Leobeck College and teaching, and there were some wonderful people. I can remember John Rayner and Lionel Blue and Hugo Green and Jonathan Magonet, who is still teaching in the school. Also, I started here. And so I was convinced by the education I received in my home, in that men and women had to be equal. And I was raised in that way, with no difference between my brother and I.
Are you accepted as a rabbi in France now? I mean, are you considered a rabbi like any other rabbi?
It depends who you ask the question. I think first I have my own community. It's now 600 families. So it has grown a lot and developed a lot. I'm lucky to have also another colleague working with me, who is a man, Rabbi Etienne Kerber, who also studied partly in France, partly at Leobec College. And so my congregants respect me fully as a rabbi. And then outside, it depends who you're talking to, but I feel I'm quite well accepted in the French Jewish landscape.
Also, you're married, you have 4 children, you're married to another rabbi, Tom Cohen.
Right.
He is the head of the American Jewish congregation in Paris. Is it also a liberal congregation?
Yes, it is.
What does it mean to be a liberal? What is the difference between Orthodox religion, Orthodox rabbis, conservative ones, and liberal?
So there are 2 main principles, I would say, that define liberal Judaism. The first one is that we believe in a progressive revelation. We said that Mount Sinai was a unique moment of revelation, but not the unique one, not the only one.
Mount Sinai means when the 10 Commandments were delivered to Moses.
That's right. And so progressive means that revelation can happen at any time, even now, that the revelation is not only in the past, but that even people today and every century could express the will of God. And that we're still searching. We don't know exactly what is the will of God. So that's the first principle. The second principle is that we are convinced that Judaism has always changed according to the place and time that it developed, and that there is no reason why it shouldn't change also.
You mean that Judaism has to adapt,
exactly.
For instance, at the modern times?
Exactly. So, which means that liberal Judaism makes a change, not without thinking about them, and there are assembly of rabbis that think about all the modern issues and also issues that were decided before. And we are adapting Judaism to the modern time. So one of the changes, obviously, is the equality of men and women.
Men and women.
But there are also issues like the identity of the Jews. How do you transmit Judaism? So the time of the Bible, it was only through fathers that Judaism or Hebraism was transmitted. And then when you go to the Mishnah, the first centuries with the Talmud, it went to the mother. The definition of Jewish identity was you are Jewish because you are
your
mother
is Jewish.
And so what progressive Judaism said was that the most important was not the birth, but the birth was important, but the education was the main thing. Because you
can be Jewish if you have a Jewish father, for instance,
that's right.
Or not.
If you have a Jewish education, the main accent was put on Jewish education, which means that today there are people that have Jewish father or Jewish mother, that if they have Jewish education, they are recognized as Jews. They have to study. It's not automatic, but still they can be considered Jewish and be included in the community.
But in the Jewish religions, there are, as in any other religion, there are holidays, there are rituals, there are prayers. Are these prayers and these rituals similar in the liberal community, or you do other prayers? Or
it's not a new religion. It's a tendency of Judaism that is actually the main one now in numbers, because the World Union for Progressive Judaism exists in more than 50 countries and almost 2 million Jews. The festivals are the same festivals, the prayers are the same prayers, except that within the prayers, for example, we don't pray for the rebuilding of the temple because we don't want to go back to animal sacrifices. So there are changes in the vocabulary, in also the content of some prayers, because we believe, like former text would say, that the prayer should correspond to our conscience. We can't say things we don't agree with.
But in the normal rule of Judaism, I mean, not normal, but in the traditional rule, for instance, there are prayers, like a very famous prayer, the Jews, which is the Kaddish. Normally, you cannot recite the Kaddish unless there are 10 men who have had the Bar Mitzvah, right? Bar Mitzvah meaning that they became adults, right?
Yeah.
10 adults, Bar Mitzvah, Jewish men, whoever they are, to recite a certain number of prayers. So what happens if, for instance, in the liberal world?
The first thing would be to say it's not fair.
It's not fair.
Why women are not included. So from that question, which obviously comes from the Enlightenment and the idea that men and women should be equal, we're going to ask the question, where does it come from? And then we realize that in the codes, like the Shulchan Aruch, who was written by Joseph Caro in 16th centuries, it says that it's 10 people that are free. And at the time where it was thought, this idea of a minyan of 10...
Minyan means 10 people.
10 people for the prayer. They believed that women were not free, that they had to obey their husband and they couldn't lead the prayers. And so you need to have a group of people who have the same degree of obligation. But if we say that women have the same degree of obligation and that they should be equal,
then you need 10 people.
Then you need 10 people.
Men and women.
That's right. So we believe that it was simply 10 men because of circumstances in the patriarchal world where women didn't have the same rights and duties. It's something we want to change. So we now, in progressive Judaism, we include women in the minyan, because not including them means also to say, well, if you come or you don't come, it's not necessary. Your presence is not necessary.
Instead,
yes. And if you say to women, like you said to men, your presence, we need you to build a community, then it feels right to do that.
I think, I'm not sure, that a rabbi is not a priest.
Right.
A rabbi is a professor, right?
Yes, exactly.
And therefore, it's not the man who's reciting the prayer, it's not necessarily a rabbi. Yeah. So what is your role? And I think you wrote a thesis about the concept of conversion, right? Yes. From other religion to Judaism. It's a public knowledge that it's very difficult to become Jewish. And there are lots of things that you have to do before convincing that you can become a Jew, right? Because Jews do not want to convert people historically. What is your idea of that? Because we said that even if you have a Jewish father, if you study, you can be considered Jewish. But if you're not Jewish and suddenly you want to become Jewish, what happens in your liberal way of thinking?
Okay, so I hear two questions. What is the role of the rabbi? And the question about
so let's start with what is the role of the rabbi.
Okay, you were right in saying that the rabbi is a teacher. You know the word Rav in Hebrew, that it's the etymology of rabbi. It means a lot because rabbis are supposed to know more than maybe others, which is not always true about Judaism. So the first role is to be a teacher. A teacher means not only a teacher formally in a classroom with adults, with adolescents, with children, but it means also in an informal way. You can teach when you meet someone in the streets or in the supermarket. It's also informal teaching is very important. So we teach a lot. That is to say, we try to transmit our love and passion for text and Judaism, the ethics of Judaism, which is very important, and also the philosophy of this religion that has survived for all those years. In a way, it's a miracle that it survives, Jews being so few, that the ideas of Judaism are still have an impact on society. But so that's the first role of the rabbi.
But in practice, what do you do?
Yes.
I mean, what is your job?
Yes, of course. So we teach, we have classes. We also accompany people in the main events of their lives, that is to say birth, growing up, bar and bat mitzvah, weddings, and also the saddest part of life, the end of life, and could be illness and also death. So we are there to accompany people, to say prayers, but also to give psychological support. Pastoral work is very important. We visit people in hospital, in their homes. So that's the second part. And the third part could be more organizational type of work, because the community is also a place where lots of things can happen, cultural things, and we help with the organization of any religious or cultural events. So it's a very varied, there's not one day that is the same as the next.
And about the conversion?
Yes. So conversion, actually, a lot of people think that Judaism is not doing proselytism, which is true now, but was not always true. Actually, since I had to study the subjects, there are many texts in Judaism that advise to not only open the door, but even some of them that to go after converts. What happened in the first centuries when Christianity developed is that Christians learned from the Jews the ways to convert and then forbade the Jews to do it. We see that in all the interdiction of proselytism by the emperors in the Roman period, from Constantinus, when the religion of the state of Rome became Christianity. So there are many, many laws against Jews that were still doing conversion. And if you look at the whole history of the Jewish people, then you see that even when the death penalty was the response to converting, rabbis kept doing conversion, and the text, except for one or two, are very favorable to conversion. So what is happening today is that in progressive Judaism, we don't look for converts. Active proselytism is not on the agenda at all, but we do passive proselytism. That is to say, we welcome people who would like to become Jewish.
But they have to study.
Of course. It's not automatic like it was at the time of the Talmud. And you can see in the Talmud, it says that to someone who wants to convert, you teach a little bit of commandments that are light and some more stringent. So what we do is we teach them. They have a whole course, a serious course. First, they have to learn to read and write Hebrew, and then they have to learn about Judaism for a whole year in order to live all the major festivals. So they have to learn. They also have to belong to a community, to a congregation, and come very regularly for Shabbat and festivals. And also they have to introduce Jewish practice at home. So it's not easy.
But possible.
But it's possible. And
but as liberals, you have the same rules. In other words, just as an example, you have to eat kosher like the Orthodox Jews, or
kashrut is very important.
Kashrut is
all the laws
about the food. No,
yes. Kashrut is important to us. The way we teach kashrut is a bit different from the Orthodox. It depends which Orthodox, because there are also many different trends in Orthodoxy. Of course, we studied the laws of kashrut. We ask for not to eat any forbidden food like all the forbidden animals. We ask to separate milk and meat, but we also think about an eco-kashrut, which means that we think about how animals are being treated, because it's a principle that is very important in Judaism, Sa'ar ba'alei chayim, which is not to cause pain to animals. We're thinking a lot about, for example, not eating eggs that come from industrial producing. We're trying to sensitize people to thinking about not only the food, but also how the people are treated when they work for food industry. For example, my synagogue is now completely vegetarian. And this is also our way to contribute to the environment.
Why liberal Judaism is more popular in the Anglo-Saxon countries than it is in Latin Europe?
Progressive Judaism started in Germany before the war. It was very popular, and it was also popular in France. Chief rabbis were also influenced by those ideas at the time. Then, after the war, the center became England and the United States. I think probably because in Catholic cultures of Catholic countries, you have one way to think and a more vertical way of thinking, decision-making, like in the Catholic Church. And in the Anglo-Saxon world, it's more the Protestant culture and a more horizontal way of taking decision. But slowly, progressive Judaism has developed in many different countries, and the Anglo-Saxon world is very much advanced in producing, studying material and the organization of communities. But in other countries now, including in Italy, congregations are developing as well.
But even if your community became bigger, larger over the years, the impression that one has is that in one way, there are more and more secular people, less and less people who go to synagogues or who follow the rules or who recite prayers. And in the other hand, there are more and more ultra-Orthodox people, right? I mean, it's like two extremes that seem to be the tendency of today. Is it right, or how do you handle that? How do you live inside that situation? The young people are coming more to you, to your liberal way of thinking. They become more Orthodox, or they just think they are Jewish, but they don't practice religion.
Well, you're right in saying that extreme Orthodox are more numerous. And that, for example, in France, the majority is not practicing. But I think they are coming back. And I see the development of progressive Judaism. We are now something like 15 different communities in France. All those communities are very active. So I believe that, people that were far away from practice and communities and studying, that they actually feel the lack of meaning in their lives, and that slowly they are coming back. So maybe it's just because I'm optimistic, but if we go on the way we've been going on like the last 10, 20 years, I think progressive Judaism will develop more, and that more people will come back to their roots, because with modernity, people need to find their roots.
But besides the fact that you believe strongly in equality between men and women, which is very much also the tendency of the world of today, right? And women have made a lot of progress in society in general. There are more and more women who have prominent roles in business, in politics, in science, everywhere. Do you feel equally respected as a woman rabbi? Is it now normal, at least in the liberal Judaism, to have a woman rabbi or a man rabbi? Doesn't make a difference.
I think probably still less than in the Anglo-Saxon world, because we are only 5 here in France. So
only 5 women.
Yes, so we are still an exception. In my community, I feel completely respected. And in general, and not only in religious world, equality is not yet achieved. And so we have a lot of work to do. And I often say that when I was taking my children to school, I would hear very often some women saying to their boys, don't cry like a little girl. And so we still have a lot of work to do for equality. We see also in some countries of the world that it's going backward. It's a fight. It's not finished.
Now, to go back to something which is very much into nowadays life of Judaism, in the last, not only now, but in the last decade or decades, we have seen that many European communities, diaspora Jews in Europe, and mostly in France, because France is a very large Jewish community, because of terrorism, because of anti-Semitism, because of these reasons, they moved to Israel from here. And nowadays, sadly, we assist to a lot of problems in Israel. And what's going on in Israel is unfortunately creating a wave of anti-Semitism, which is above the normal level, right? I mean, normal. There should not be any anti-Semitism or anti-any other religion. Nevertheless, the prejudice is there. What do you think about all this? And how do you leave this as a French or a European diaspora community, liberal or not liberal?
Well, first, it's not easy to see anti-Semitism going back up. Last week, I visited a woman of my community who had to hide during the war. And she told me she had to take off her mezuzah because she was afraid. The anti-Semitism is rising, and you're right in saying that it's in the echo of what's happening in Israel. It's sad to see that, because a lot of people thought it was behind and living happy in France. like in Europe. So we have to be vigilant. Some people left for Israel, some French Jews, but I think it's more some Orthodox Jews that left and that were living in the suburbs of Paris. In my community, a few left, but not that many. And I see, which is quite surprising, but since the 7th of October, more people coming back to the synagogue.
Since the events of October 7th?
Yes, because they feel they need to be together and know what is to be Jewish and not to be defined like Jean-Paul Sartre by the others. And they need to know what it means to be Jewish in a positive way. And so they come to synagogue to feel this solidarity. The situation is very complex and difficult. A lot of Jews feel that they're not understood, that whatever they say or whatever they do, it will not be understood. They also think that more than ever they have to reclaim their Judaism.
But in front of this rising of anti-Semitism, which is very much also linked to this war and to the fact that there are more and more activities in favor of the Palestinians and not so many in favor of the Jews, and that the international press and also politics, have a tendency to have changed their vision. The events of October 8th have been not cancelled, but they seem less terrible than what the Israelis are doing in Gaza and all that. What is the role of a rabbi? How can you reassure people about the fear when you see Israeli flags that are burned and all these things that happen, and people who are murdered or who are again under threat?
What we did since the October 7th is we had different evenings. We had information first. I think the role of rabbis, we're not in the front of the battle, but we are in the far backs of the battle. So we feel as rabbis that it's being a rabbi in wartime, although we're not over there. But we have to try and first make sure that the Jewish community has the right information in the whirlwind of media, because information has become a weapon. And so it's very difficult to know what is happening because we realize that the media is inside the war, is taking sides. So I think, which is a Jewish principle, to find the truth about what happens is the first mission we have, trying to know. And often when we find the right sources for information, we discover that what has been said is not really the truth. So I believe it has become a rabbinical role now to find the truth.
Somehow, even among the Jews, the image of Israel has changed, right?
Yes.
Especially between secular and liberal people, right? They may say, oh, this is happening because, there are too many Orthodox Jews and the politics of Israel are influenced by extreme thinking, and therefore not all the Jews are in solidarity with what is happening in Israel, and they try to say, okay, this is what happens in Israel, but we are English Jews, American Jews, French Jews, whatever.
It's true, but probably
is it like this or not, seen inside?
Well, first, in France, there is something called devoir de réserve. So the rabbis and religious people have to be careful about politics because of deontology issues. So very often we don't talk about politics even in France or in
other countries.
So I think this is not my role. My role is more talk about ethics and truth and support people. I think we have to inform people about what is really happening sur le terrain, on the field. Also, what we see from the media is very much caricature of the Israeli society, because in Israel, there are different voices, and I think it's important for people to know that. I heard recently political leader saying, we are a democratic state. Muslims should be allowed to pray on the Temple Mount and so on. And that's what's going to happen. And these voices are not heard in France at all because people want to hear only the extremists. And so they often take extremist voices. So I think, as I said, our role is to reestablish a moderation, to see that things are not black and white. For example, also to say that some Palestinians demonstrated against Hamas. We don't see that here at all. So information and the detail of the information to nuances, I think, is so important.
But what you said at the beginning, right? What is particular is that in a way, and especially in your liberal way of seeing things, or in your words, Judaism is a happy way of living, right?
Yes.
And unfortunately, in one way, it is a happy way of living, but in the other hand, it's not terribly easy to live seeing how much anti-Semitism is coming out.
Yes.
And in the same time, as you said, after what happened in Germany, after Auschwitz, just to simplify, after what writers like Primo Levi, like Wiesel or others wrote about what happened and the documentaries and all what we have seen, one would have thought that this would not come back. It is difficult to be Jewish, to combine happiness and fear together, right?
Yes.
Or to be feeling that people look at you in a different way.
It is very difficult. We said difficult happiness of being Jewish. I think Neher who said that, André Neher. Yes, it's difficult, and at the same time, this is precisely, the role of the rabbi. Because, for example, in a few days, we're going to celebrate Purim.
Purim is like Carnival.
It's a carnival. It's a crazy festival, we dress up and some people drink. And if you study the meaning of Purim, the story of the book of Esther, it's a guy named Haman who wanted to destroy the Jewish people. And we make it something happy, but it's a sad story. It ends well. So from the time of the Bible today, unfortunately, the Jewish people has went through very difficult time, and yet we're still here. And if you think about Hasidism that developed in the Middle Age, in a time where also Jews were
persecuted.
Yes. Hasidic rabbi said it's enough to have one little light to enlighten a whole dark room. And the philosophy of Judaism is to maintain hope in times of difficulties. When you see the horrors that were committed, both last World War and also recently, and probably still going on now with the hostages, it makes you cry and be sad. And yet we have to fight for our ideals of democracy, of humanity, of respect of every living person. The fight is the good fight.
But being a rabbi, right, being a religious figure, whatever, liberal or non-liberal, you have probably relationships with priests or imams of other religions, right?
Of course, yes.
You probably have. And in a moment like this, how do you handle this relationship with the other religious confessions?
It's not easy, and yet we managed to do it. I created here a program called Emunah, of meetings between all the
different religions.
Yes, in Sciences Po. People are working together for a year of meetings. They were in my synagogue on last Monday talking about science and religion. When you can open a true dialogue with people, then you can talk about everything, including the conflicts, including questions that can be controversial. When you know that we don't possess the truth, there was a scientific physician, Ines Safi, who is a polytechnician, and she said, truth is like a mirror that is broken, and everyone is taking a piece of that mirror. When you realize that everyone is trying to do their best and to understand the other, then you can still have friendship with people that are of different religions or that are atheists.
But you think that the attitude of, let's say, the Western governments, whatever they are, right, left, medium, whatever, somehow has changed, or the danger is always there?
Well, I can speak about France because I know more my country. We are lucky to have the protection of the government. Jews are, synagogues are protected. It doesn't mean that it's avoiding any danger, but at least the state is doing what they should be doing. The danger is still there because it's, as you said, international conflicts. And when you have people that are asking for violent acts all over the world, and it can happen everywhere. So the problem is complex. We can hear one day one speech and the next day another speech, but we know also that, for example, economical issues are also at stake, and that some countries have heavily invested in France, and that political speech is actually adapting to economical contingencies as well.
Besides the happiness, okay, that there is in the holidays or in the prayers, is Judaism a religion of hope, I imagine, no?
Of course, yes. Yes, it is.
What is the main stream, besides liberal or non-liberal or non-religious? I mean, there is one common point.
There are many things, but I would say, for example, to say that the world is not perfect, but we need to make it better. The idea of tikkun olam, repairing the world. The idea that human beings are born with a good side and a bad side, and they have to try and make sure that the good side is winning the battle. The idea of hope that exists in other religions as well, but is very present. The fact that studying and is also central to the practice. Also that ethical ideas are expressed in acts of everyday life. The idea of Shabbat is that we will gather for a day and stop the world in a way, or our world, and think about what we're doing. The idea of kashrut you mentioned earlier is to say what food is important, but how should we treat food? How should we treat the stranger? And we have to welcome foreigners and strangers. The equal dignity of every human being, and the sanctity of life, those are main ideas of Judaism.
The large majority of your life, first as a daughter, then as a student, afterward as a rabbi, has been, let's say, in a tranquil world, more or less, right? I mean, you were born in the idea that to be Jewish was like being anything else, that you have the same rights. Were you prepared to what is happening now, to this idea of defending, right? Of the fact that in order to be Jewish, you said something very sad in a way before. You said that the Jews put in front of their doors a little box with a prayer inside called mezuzah, right? And that suddenly people take it away because they are afraid of being perceived as Jews. Probably men don't wear kippas anymore. They not feel as free as before to do it.
Yes.
As a rabbi, how do you face that? What do you say to people?
At the same time, you can say no one is ever prepared to events that are this violent, but we lived also, my synagogue is very near the Bataclan and Charlie Hebdo, and so we had the military, we had soldiers in our synagogue for a long time during this period. And so we were not prepared for that, for all these attacks in cafes. And so we live in a violent world. But in a way, I was prepared because even if I grew up in a safe place, my parents had lived the war and they had transmitted to me the fear that they had because they had to flee during the war. In a way, I was prepared. And also my tradition prepares me. When you say the story of Pharaoh and the going out of Egypt, when you read all the stories of Judaism, you encounter the hostilities that can happen to the Jewish people. And yet it's amazing stories of hope, because the Hebrews went out of Egypt, they were slaves, and this story inspired all the movement of liberation of all people in the world. And there's always the idea that even in the most somber moments, you can find hope.
You said another thing which is interesting, that people gathered more into the synagogue, your synagogue, or maybe other synagogue, since the events, to feel closer. And this is because you resent, one thing is fear, another thing is loneliness. Do you think that Jews feel lonely?
Yes, they do. They do. They do in their work. They do when they have to stop talking about Israel because people tell them that they kill other people. And they do feel lonely. When they come to synagogue, they feel happier. It's not that the world disappears and the problems disappear, but they come like, my synagogue is called Mayan, the source. So they come as if to, resource themselves. And they find in the synagogue happiness, because the services are always with music and with, they are full of joy. And they tell me that afterwards, that they need more than ever to come and reconnect with them.
But they say that President Macron, I think, has said, not to talk about politics, but to talk about situation, has said that Muslims and Jews are French citizens, right? Like
Yes.
all the others.
Yes.
You are French citizens.
Absolutely.
How do the French citizens, Jews, liberal or non-liberal, feel vis-a-vis the fact that they are French, but there is Israel? How is this? Not only Israel, but in Israel there are also many French, ex-French Jews that maybe are the second or third generation and therefore became Israelis.
Yes.
How do you...
It's always the story of Jews, is that Judaism is not only a religion, it's a philosophy, and it has also a link with the land. And the text we find for thousands of years, people pray for the return to Jerusalem. And although we are diaspora Jews, we need Jews outside of Israel. I also believe that we need Israel, not only as a refuge in case of problems, but because the love of the land has been present always in our history, and the presence of the Jews also from the time of the Bible. But our link, I think, especially French Jews, because everyone has family in Israel. The Jewish community here is very connected to Israel. People go there all the time. We have to make sure that it's still a home for Jews over there, and that also there is peace in the region, and that people can live together in our ideals of equal dignity and democracy and respect for all religions.
Do you have the feeling that anti-Semitism is like COVID, like an epidemic that comes and goes, that this is a moment of tension because of the war and all that, and then it will low down? Or you think that this is a new seed, that some people said this is like in Germany in the 30s, it's like the beginning of a new wave, even in Europe or in the United States, because we have seen now that even in places like New York, where there are lots of Jews, the situation is similar to the one in Paris. In London is the same. This is not a French or an Italian or a specific country issue. It's a Western world issue.
Well, first, I always say I'm a rabbi, I'm not a prophet, so I don't know what's going to happen. I hope it will go down when the conflict will be appeased in Israel, because it is linked. I think I wrote a text called The 10 Commandments to Fight Anti-Semitism. I believe also that we have to know how to explain better who we are. Often Judaism is obscure for people, And people think it's a kind of sect that you can't go into synagogue. My synagogue is always open to everyone. And for security reasons, Jews have closed more their synagogues. But actually, I think we have to open our synagogues. We have to explain more what is Judaism, our rights and our ways of living. So that's our responsibility. Then also we have to try, and it's difficult to counter what people say in the media. For example, there were many collaboration between Palestinians and Israelis, and we have to talk about those things rather than always talking about the bad side, because they are a source of inspiration. I mean, there were people living together very nicely before all this has happened. The problem is terrorism, and we have all of us that are against terrorism. We have to fight it strongly.
It's in your own life and in the history, this idea of hiding, right? You said that when you were children, you didn't have to say that you were Jewish. This has happened in a much, much more violent way in Spain and Portugal in 1472 at the time of Isabel the Catholic. Yeah. We had seen all sorts of pogroms going on in Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of hiding. As a rabbi, and to conclude our conversation, if I came to you, right, saying, Professor, what should I do, right? How do I have to live the condition of a Jew in today's world, in today's France? What would you say?
I think we have to be prudent, but it's always been the case. We've always said to the children studying in our synagogue, take off your kippah when you're on the streets. That has always been the case. So we have to be prudent, and at the same time, we have to stay Jewish and be proud of our heritage, because otherwise it's our enemies that are winning the battle. If we disappear, we just help them doing what they want to do. I think Jews have to claim proudly their heritage, which is, for me, a wonderful treasure. At the same time, be able, as Jewish people did always, be able to adapt to the circumstances and reach out and keep meeting people of other religions and explain who we are. I think that's also very important.
So at the end of the day, what do you hope? You hope for a normality?
Yes.
That, they leave Jews in peace, and in that they say you can be this or that, and you are one of the many, and you have the right to live your own.
I hope for peace. I hope for dialogue with everyone. And yes, it's the hope of the prophets of the Bible that maybe it's not so realistic, but we have to stay optimistic.
In the Jewish world, the Jewish population, even if they are secular in a vast number, do you think that faith is important?
Yes, well, the word doesn't exist in Hebrew. It's emunah, and it's actually to be engaged in your action. I think for Judaism, action is much more important than faith.
What do you call action? To say the prayers, to be nice with the other? What is action?
It's every day, whatever you do, and also all the mitzvot, the commandments, whether ethical or rituals. But the ethicals are very important. The rituals are encouraging the ethicals. So yes, I think this is very important. And the minimum of the faith, I would say, is to believe that we are not everything, that human beings, that's why we wear the kippah, that you put on your head, to show that there is something beyond human beings, and to be optimistic. Ahad Aham, who was a Jewish thinker, a Jewish Israeli thinker, said that to be realistic in Israel, you have to believe in miracles.
And the fact that you are a mother of 4 children, that your husband is himself an American rabbi, are you a happy family?
I hope so.
I mean, is it easy to raise the children in?
It's not easy to raise children in a world that is not what we would like it to be. But I think our children are good people, and that's what's the most important.
And is it difficult to be a mother and a rabbi together?
Well, I hope I was a good mother, that I am a good mother, and I hope I am a good rabbi. And of course, you have to share your time, but it's the same for my husband, who is also a rabbi. And being a good mother is actually teaching you also to be a good rabbi, and vice versa.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Alain Elkann interviews.